I'll tell him the reality, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell him the reality. His welfare programme is failing. His welfare reform programme is failing because there isn't the work, and his economic strategy is failing. And that is the reality. He has a work programme that isn't working, a growth strategy that's not delivering, and a deficit that is rising. It is a government that is failing, a Prime Minister that is failing, and the British people... Calm down, calm down. He just can't keep his cool when he knows he's losing the argument, Mr. Speaker. And it's the British people that are paying the price for his failure.
Mr. Speaker, but the Prime Minister must have studied his government's own report, which shows that the Future Jobs Fund had a net benefit to participants, employers and society. And given this report, and given that youth unemployment is now higher in Leicester than it was at the general election, why did he tell me at questions a year ago that the Future Jobs Fund provided just, and I quote, phony jobs?
McClymon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of Opposition a moment ago asked the Prime Minister whether it was the case that long-term unemployment had risen by 96% since the work programme was introduced. He did not receive an answer. Can I ask the Prime Minister again, is it the case that long-term unemployment has risen by 96% since the work programme was introduced?
Answer the question.
I've given the figures for the work programme. 800,000 people taking part, 200,000 people getting work, and this is against a background where over the last quarter unemployment's coming down, the rate of youth unemployment is coming down, and there are more people in work. That is a record that we can build on.
Since the Prime Minister denounced aggressive tax avoidance as morally repugnant, why is his own government now itself actively promoting aggressive tax avoidance by cutting the tax on multinationals that open a finance company in a tax haven from the current 23% to just 5%? How can we be one nation when the government's on the side of the tax dodgers?
Research by the charity Save the Children reveals shockingly that in our country 1 in 7 children does not have a warm coat this winter. The government is now cutting child benefit support to 100,000 families who look after disabled children. Surely, whatever our views on how our economic problems were brought about, surely it cannot be right that children, the poorest and the most vulnerable, pay the most for this economic crisis.
Yes, lots of emails in response to the work programme statistics. Even by his recent standards, that was a woeful performance by David Cameron. His refusal to answer a simple, direct question only increases the public's mistrust of politicians. That from Peter Kane. Jim Broughton, though, said it's incredible how negative Ed Miliband is about almost every initiative to get the country back on its feet. And this from Geoffrey Brooking and Crawley. Ed Miliband has got some cheek. Try preaching to the country about unemployment. Under Labour, it paid not to work. Under Cameron's Conservatives, it pays to work. But John Wakefield in London says David Cameron's future work fund, as he calls it, for young people may be cheaper than the last government's policy, but at least the last government's policy actually worked. It's evident that unemployment may be falling, but long-term unemployment is increasing, and those being employed are mainly getting part-time jobs only. And for those of you who are asking about why members of the Labour front bench were wearing red ribbons, that was to mark Worldwide AIDS Day, which takes place on Saturday.
Oh, it's not today?
No.
But they're wearing the ribbons today?
It is on Saturday, but it is, yes, Fight Against HIV campaign running this week.
The interesting phrase, Nick, that came from the Prime Minister, and it's clearly the Tories are ramping up the rhetoric on welfare now and on various things to do with that. Labour reads the polls. It's a difficult subject for Labour. Mr Cameron's new phrase about Labour, the party of something for nothing. He said it twice.
Yes, well, I think it's as clear as it possibly can be that the Chancellor is about to announce further welfare cuts and then turn around to the Labour Party and say, go on, what are you going to do? You opposed the cap on total housing benefit. It seems to be quite likely that cap could come down as a way of inviting another parliamentary occasion to do it, that there'll be some reduction in the rate of increase of benefits. Remember, benefits go up in April, and usually at this time of the year, the Chancellor tells us by what rate they go up. It'll be less than the rate of inflation, I think. Certainly for those people out of work, possibly not for pensioners. I think unlikely to be any amendments on pensioners. So what the Tories want next week to be about is a row about what future cuts to make and about welfare. What Labour wants the row to be about is, hold on, you told us you were going to bring the deficit and borrowing down and debt too, and you haven't. And that will be the argument, I think, that takes place for the next week or so.
Indeed. What will Labour do about welfare, Sadiq Khan? It's part of the policy process as you gear up for policies towards 2015. I mean, I interviewed Liam Byrne last Sunday on the Sunday Politics. It's not yet clear that the direction that Labour wants to go in.
We're in favour of welfare reform. If you look at the 13 years we were in government, our welfare to work programme, the New Deal, the flexible New Deal, Future Jobs Fund, getting people out of welfare into work, making it a requirement upon somebody to go to job interviews, making it incumbent upon you to do certain things. The system is still not perfect, and that's why we support, for example, universal credit. We recognise, though, housing costs vary around the country, so to have one cap on housing doesn't really work.
Mainly because of London and the South East.
Use it. I mean, for example, if you live in Rotherham, the cost of your housing is far cheaper than if you live in Tooting, and so having a universal cap applying to Rotherham and Tooting doesn't really work, bearing in mind, and Housing Benefit recognises this by having different levels for South London versus Rotherham. So we agree there needs to be reform. The problem is the consequences of the government's plans, both the transitional arrangements and the fact their IT system won't work, means we're really concerned.
That's unusual, a government IT system that doesn't work. When did that ever happen?
They've delayed and it's a big bang approach which IDS has to do, which is why you heard reports which Ed Miliband alluded to about arguments between George Osborne and Ian Duncansby yesterday, because what they promised, the deficit going down because welfare bills going down, hasn't happened because we've got real problems with the long-term unemployed and there being zero growth.
Maybe you actually have more in common than the debate would suggest.
Well, if only it were true. Saying you're in favour of welfare reform is all motherhood and apple pie. When it comes to a vote in the House of Commons about what are we going to do, that's what matters in politics. And last week, again, I think it was about the 8th time I've voted in favour of a cap on benefits so that people who are out of work can't take home more than the average family takes home in work. I think it was about the 8th time I'd had to vote in favour of that because Labour keep on voting against it. It came back from the House of Lords. We had to vote on it again. It's going to happen, but Labour are putting up every possible barrier. And so we are absolutely reforming welfare to make sure work always pays. We're piloting the universal credit. The IT is, of course, IT is difficult, but it is on track. And we're going to reform welfare so we don't have a something-for-nothing culture. And unfortunately for Labour, everybody knows that under Labour, these things got worse and worse.
Well, I was going to move us on to Leveson if you want to move on.
Yeah, but just before we do, I just want to talk about... I just wanted to make one... No. Excuse me, I'm in charge, and I have no intention of letting you be in charge, which probably means I will under your language, but never mind. Let me just put this work programme that the government has made so much of. Sometimes in PMQs you can't get the figures right, so let me just go through them with you, because I studied it this morning. Let's take the 14 months. That's the longer figure, so we'll give you the benefit of the longer period. The figures are that 800,000 people have gone into some kind of work under this programme, but only 31,000 are still in a job after 6 months. Now, the government had assumed that even with no programme, 5% would be in a job after 6 months. So actually, you had a better chance of getting a job by not going into the programme than going into the programme.
No, well, that's not the case. The first thing I'd say is this. It's very difficult in politics and unhelpful in the long term to base an argument on inaccuracies. And so when Ed Miliband said only 2% of people got a job... Hold on, no, I'll come to it. Let me answer the...
He made a mistake. I haven't. You answer my question.
You let me answer the question, right? So a quarter of the people have gone into a job, which is very positive news, and that's around 200,000, just over. Now, of course, how many have been in for 6 months is a growing number, but because the programme only started 14 months ago, it takes time to get people in and to keep them in work for 6 months. And that 31,000 figure you mentioned has gone up in the last 2 months, from the 12-month figure to the 14th-month figure, has gone up much faster than earlier, because when you get a programme off the ground, it takes time to get going, but then it is rising more rapidly. But the key point is this: should we have a system to try to get people off benefits and into work that pays by results? Of course we should.
No.
And
The key point is
Apple pie, Matthew.
the key point is that only 3% of people who've gone into this programme end up in a job
That's the facts.
which survives
In
after 6 months. That's the key point. And the cost of this has been 475 million to date. Works out, I've told on average, at about £14,000 a job.
So if we talk about the cost of it, the cost to the taxpayer per job is just over £2,000, because we're paying by results. If the results are poorer, the taxpayer pays less. Hold on. And that's the argument about the Future Jobs Fund, which costs £7,000 per job.
Okay.
So of course, would we like youth unemployment to be
hasn't
lower?
worked, Matthew. Just fess up.
It is working.
You've had 20 minutes now. Come on.
I'll tell you what,
I tell you
we'll
what,
come back to it when we have 18 months of figures, and we'll see.
To him, there'll be
the
like
way it's going.
be in the moon by then.
We shall
sort of,
see.
you know.
The proof of the pudding shall be